Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with our final bonus episode of the season.
Final bonus episode.
We are rounding out season 3 today, Brad. This is our season finale, where we take our bracket of 32 movies that has now been whittled down to 8, and we crown the champion of the season 3 films. How are you feeling so far, Brad? Are you still feeling pretty good about everything?
Oh, mine's fine.
Yeah,
I feel great about it. Spectacular.
I have never felt as personally attacked as I did after you knocked Coco out the other day, and I am coming back with a vengeance here today.
Bob, I just want to remind you that I did not, in fact, knock Coco out. The coin of destiny chose, my friend.
Okay, well, you're directly responsible for that, but that's fine. That's fine. We're going to move on. So for those of you who maybe didn't check out our prior episode, we'd encourage you to go back to that one. At the end of every season, we put all of our movies into a madness-style bracket and eliminate them one by one until we get to crown the champion of each season. Before we get started today, Brad, I do want to jump right in, but I want to take a moment to say to our audience that we would love to encourage you to become a patron on our Patreon account. We've been putting out a ton of content lately for our subscribers on Patreon. We have 3 different tiers that you can subscribe at, $3, $5, and $7 a month. And at each tier, you get something really exciting. And you know, Brad, we have a couple patrons that are sponsoring us at our $7 amount. And for them, we're actually making exclusive bonus episodes that only they get to hear. So if you like what we're doing, please consider sponsoring us on patreon.com/filmwhiskey.
But Bob, what if they want to subscribe at $107 a month?
No.
They're not allowed?
I'm just kidding.
we need to have a quick business meeting here, Bob.
Yeah, Brad, I think we'll take all comers at this point, but we're only asking $7 of you. But if you'd like to contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, we will gladly accept that form of payment as well.
That would be fine by us.
That's right. Brad, we have a job cut out for us today, and as we get into this bracket, we're also going to be sipping on 3 different whiskeys from Westland Distillery in Seattle, Washington. I've been in conversation with them for a couple months now. We were going to have them on the show earlier in the season, but things got delayed by those terrible wildfires that they had out in Washington, and so we are incredibly grateful to them for sending us product. We can't wait to feature it here on the show today. But before we get there, Brad, let's jump into this bracket and let's eliminate some movies from existence. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, so our first matchup in the group of 8 is the number 1 overall seed, It's a Wonderful Life, up against the number 8 seed, Psycho. Brad, what are your initial thoughts on this matchup when you see it here on paper?
I think that you would be psychotic not to choose It's a Wonderful Life in this matchup.
You know, I think we're both going to choose It's a Wonderful Life. But there's part of me that really feels like Psycho at least deserves a little bit more conversation before we send it on its way. Do you know what I mean? This is a matchup of 2 titans here. And just because we each prefer one over the other, I think that Psycho is still a worthy opponent for It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, I mean, Psycho's a fine movie and all. It's not what I had chosen to get to here. I think that it's a movie worth watching. I don't know if I would ever watch it again. And that might be the most damning thing I can say about it, because it really is a great movie, but not one that intrigues me enough to go back and see another time.
I think that sometimes, Brad, I get really lost and confused in your own personal ranking or rating system, because if I recall correctly, you gave Psycho a 9.5 out of 10. And then 30 seconds ago, you just said, it's a fine movie. So I guess maybe I assumed that you liked the movie better than you did. And then 10 seconds after that, you said it was a great movie. So I think I'm kind of getting vibes that you're all over the place on Psycho. Did you not really like it that much?
No, Bob, I mean, I did give it a 9.5. I think it's a really great movie. It's just one that, for me personally, I'm just fine with it. I think there is an element of, I can recognize the history of the movie. I can recognize the technical brilliance. I can recognize how the cinematography was just really amazing, especially with a B crew that Hitchcock was using. But all of those things don't make me go, you know what I want to do tonight? Watch Psycho again.
Wow, interesting.
And so that's for me. I can recognize that a movie is technically brilliant and not really have any desire to watch it again.
All right. Well, I thought this would be a much better conversation than it's ended up being, but Brad seems 100% ready to throw this movie under the bus, or to throw it in the path of Norman Bates' knife, at least. So, any final thoughts on Psycho before we toss it into the fiery furnace?
Who's Norman Bates?
All right. So it looks like It's a Wonderful Life is moving on pretty easily into our round of 4. And that takes us to the second matchup in our round of 8, which is the number 4 overall seed, The Fellowship of the Ring, up against the number 5 seed, North by Northwest. Brad, I'm hoping, I know what you're going to choose, but I'm hoping that you're at least going to be a little bit more respectful to this Alfred Hitchcock movie as it goes up against one of your favorites in Fellowship of the Ring. And I really do think that all of our matchups in the round of 8 here are just tremendous matchups. Even if you do lean towards one more heavily than the other, you really do have to give props to the opponents in this round.
Yeah, Bob, North by Northwest is a movie that I grew up watching. I obviously it came out way before Fellowship, but for me, I probably saw North by Northwest when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, around when I saw Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
So, I love North by Northwest. Cary Grant is probably a top 2 or 3 actor for me as far as like my personal favorites. So this was no slouch for me when it came to picking Fellowship over it. But in the end, for me, The Fellowship is the clear choice here. As a movie, it is just so momentous, and it sets, a precedent for fantasy cinema that I don't think has really been matched since. And so Fellowship is just such an important movie for me. It's such a beautiful, beautiful film. I'm choosing it to move on.
Yeah, Brad, I'm choosing it here as well. And I think that North by Northwest is the kind of movie that it's in danger of falling into that trap that we sometimes have as people who critique movies, where it just doesn't seem to be like a weighty enough movie. And yet, there's something to be said about a movie that is as big in scope as this one is, that spans the entire continent, that is just so cinematic. And just because it is an adventure movie that doesn't have much to say under the surface, doesn't mean that it's not an incredible undertaking by the director Alfred Hitchcock, and that it isn't a prime example of Hitchcock's abilities as a director. It is absolutely one of the most, I keep using this word, but it's like one of the most cinematic movies I can think of. And I think it deserves a lot of recognition for that. But at the end of the day, I do think Fellowship is just a better movie, or it's at least an equal movie, but it definitely just seems to have a little bit more heft to it than North by Northwest does. And so for that reason, I am also moving it on into the round of 4. Well, Brad, those were 2 really quick matchups. I thought we may have a little bit more discussion on those, but it looks like our 2 first entries into the final 4 are It's a Wonderful Life and The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Brad, at this time, we are going to start giving out our Film and Whiskey Awards for Season 3. We do this every year, and some of them are based on our own gut feelings and things we like and dislike, and some of them are driven by nerdiness and math and statistics. And these are the first 3 awards that we're giving out today. The first one, Brad, I'd love you to take a guess at, without looking at our final scores. This is the most overrated movie. This is the award we give out to the film that we had the biggest discrepancy with versus IMDb users. So this movie had a pretty positive IMDb rating and a much more negative one from us. And we choose the movie with the biggest discrepancy there to say that it is the most overrated by the general population. Brad, do you want to take a guess as to what the most overrated movie is?
That is a tough one. I'm going to guess The African Queen.
No, but you're not terribly far off, Brad. It's another movie that came close to the bottom of our list. In fact, it was our lowest ranked movie of the year, Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, it's the one that I refuse to even talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Brad, did you know that Bohemian Rhapsody has an 8.0 on IMDb?
Bob, I think I just vomited
an
a little
8.0.
bit in my mouth.
It has a higher rating than something like Apollo 13. I don't know what people see in this movie. We gave it a 3.0 on average. And our friend Chris Blattner, I think, gave it either a 2 or a 2.5. Like, if we were factoring his in, it would be even farther apart. But on average, Brad, people rank that movie 5 points out of 10 higher than we do. And I'm not going to lie, Brad, sometimes I can see why people like a movie and it's just not for me. This is one of those instances where I'm like, what movie are other people watching here?
Yeah. Dude, I'm telling you, man, people just love Queen as a band. Like, they just love their music. They make feel-good anthems. And the movie had some of those anthems in it. Therefore, it's an 8 out of 10, I guess?
I guess so.
Oh, man, do we just want to derail the rest of the episode and just trash on Bohemian Rhapsody again? Because I'm ready.
Yeah, I am too, to be honest with you. So, Bohemian Rhapsody has won our most overrated movie of the year, which means it's time for us to get a little bit more positive with our most underrated film of the year. This is the movie that IMDb users were not as hot on as we were, that we really, really liked. And Brad, this is one that is, it's always a little bit closer than the most overrated one is. But this movie, for us, we gave it a 9.75 out of 10, and IMDb users only gave it a 7.6. Any guesses as to what that might be?
I think you already mentioned it. I'm going to guess that it is Apollo 13.
It is Apollo 13. This is a movie that the more I watch it, the more I just think I wouldn't change a darn thing about this movie. It might be perfectly made. And I don't think people recognize that. And, you kind of hinted at this last episode, but you were talking about how historical dramas are just it's a genre of movie that we accept a certain level of like adequacy.
Yeah.
And if it meets that threshold, we don't really think about it any more than we need to. And so I think there's just a ton of historical dramas out there that are just fine. But then you have a movie like Apollo 13 where it's way better than just fine. But I think sometimes in our memories, we just kind of lump it in with all those other perfectly standard historical dramas. And I think it really deserves a rewatch, and I think people need to reevaluate it.
Yeah, it's really a phenomenal movie. And I guess I'm surprised that both of our awards that we've given so far were taken by historical dramas. That's just fascinating.
No, it's true. So, most underrated film, Apollo 13. And that takes us to our last one for now, which is the most divided. This is where Brad and I had the biggest discrepancy between our scores. Brad, this one actually wasn't that big of a deal this year. I think we were 2.5 points apart. So we had nothing like a Fight Club or an Eternal Sunshine or anything like that. Do you want to venture a guess as to what our most divided score was?
Oh, would it be Return of the Jedi?
It would not be Return of the Jedi.
Oh.
Yeah, so there you go. I'm not as far off from you as you think I am on Return of the Jedi. It's actually a movie that you just mentioned a little bit ago, and that would be The African Queen, which is kind of like a bummer for me because I haven't thought about that movie since we reviewed it. I gave it a 7.5. I thought it was like a 3 out of 4 star movie. It was fine. It was enjoyable. You were much cooler on it though, Brad. You actually only gave it a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, I don't remember enjoying that movie at any point. Like when I think about the reasons that people give me for not liking black and white movies, where they're like, oh, it's long and it's boring and it's just a bunch of people talking and there's not really much going on. I could apply all of those things to The African Queen and I'd be like, yep, I get it. Obviously that's not the case. I love, just absolutely adore classic cinema, but The African Queen for me falls into that category.
All right, Brad. Well, there you have it. Our first 3 Film and Whiskey Awards of Season 3. But we have to get back into this bracket for the latter half of our round of 8 matchups. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, Brad. So moving into the right side of our bracket, we have the number 2 seed, Citizen Kane, going up against number 7, Double Indemnity. Once again, Brad, I feel like there's a heavy favorite here in this matchup. And I would be surprised if I heard you say that you chose Double Indemnity over Citizen Kane. But I still think it's worth mentioning, once again, Double Indemnity, a phenomenal movie, a movie that we both enjoyed the hell out of, a classic example of film noir. Once again, Billy Wilder just knocking it out of the park. But for me, it just, I would not choose it up against a Citizen Kane.
Yeah, honestly, Bob, as I look at these two films, I think the biggest problem with both of these films is that not enough people have seen them. Mm-hmm. Going into this season, I had never even heard of Double Indemnity, and I had never even thought about watching Citizen Kane. It's the best movie of all time. And I was just kind of like, well, I don't know, but I don't feel like watching it. And I will say this. These are probably my two biggest surprises for the year. You know, I was just flabbergasted with how much I loved Double Indemnity as well as Citizen Kane. You know, Citizen Kane, I think, is the more ambitious movie. You know, I think that Double Indemnity just sat down and said, you know what? How can we just tell an interesting story? And it's going to be small and self-contained. It's just about this woman who is kind of a black widow and a detective who falls into her trap. And it's simple, and that's all it needs to be. And it's brilliant in its execution. But man, when you get into Citizen Kane, it's just massively ambitious. It spans, you know, the entire lifetime of this man. It's a phenomenal 10.5 out of 10 movie that, once again, more people need to see. So if there's any movie that I would recommend anybody go see from this season, it would be these two, Double Indemnity and Citizen Kane.
But with that said, Brad, are we both in agreement that Citizen Kane moves on to the Final Four?
Come on, bro. Come on.
It is with heavy hearts, then, that we send Double Indemnity off into oblivion. But that means that Citizen Kane moves on, and that leaves only one more matchup to finalize our Final Four, and that is the number 14 seed, Return of the Jedi, up against the number 6 seed, Apollo 13. Brad, you already know where I'm going with this. I had Coco winning my bracket. So anything going up against Return of the Jedi at this point is probably going to be beating Return of the Jedi in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's fair to a point. You know, you got to go with your heart when you can. If you want to fall down to the dark side, it's all good. But yeah, Apollo 13 is an amazing film. You know, we just talked about it for a little while in reference to the atrocity that Bohemian Rhapsody was. Apollo 13 is a great movie. It's a human drama that is stirring and captivating. I think Tom Hanks gives such a phenomenal performance. But for me, once again, I am going with Return of the Jedi, Bob.
I get it.
It's my movie, man.
You know, the thing is too, Brad, I will say this. This is a much closer debate in my mind. And it honestly does not come down to me wanting revenge or anything like that against you. I just think that this movie has some very obvious flaws to it. And even though I enjoy it probably equally as much as Apollo 13, I've just gotten done saying, like, I don't think I would change a thing about Apollo 13. And at the end of the day, I think I want to reward that more than ignore the flaws of Return of the Jedi, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I think for me, I'm probably in the same spot. I think Apollo 13 is a little bit tighter of a film. It has a better pacing to the movie. But I just think Return of the Jedi, once again, it tells a more ambitious story. And it not even tells, it wraps up a more ambitious story in such a beautiful way that I think I just need to flip the coin of destiny.
Yeah, I think you do, Brad. So we're going to give Return of the Jedi heads and Apollo 13 tails for a spot in the Final Four. Brad, flip that coin.
Here we go. Bob, Return of the Jedi is a movie that will be going on ahead of Apollo 13.
Wow. All right. Return of the Jedi is into the Final Four. Way ahead of where I had it getting knocked out. I'm sure Brad had it getting at least to this point. But that means that our 4 final films have been set. It's a Wonderful Life, The Fellowship of the Ring, Citizen Kane, and Return of the Jedi. Brad, this is really going to be a heavy-hitting Final Four. First impressions, Brad.
Man, this, I personally think, might be one of our best Final Fours of all time. I'd have to
out
look
of the
back.
3 that we've done. This is
three
right
that
up
we've
there.
done.
Definitely a top 3 Final Four.
Every single time we do this bracket now, I get so excited for our 32nd season so that we can do either a whole season's worth of rewatch of all the top films.
Yeah.
I think doing a bracket of all of our number 1 films would be great. I think doing a bracket of all of our number 32 films would be amazing, and then choosing each one to win based on which one was worse and deciding the worst of the 32 films. I think Bohemian Rhapsody might take the cake.
It would be really close.
but we'll see. So I love these brackets, and I think that this Final Four, I will say, it has 3 of my 4 favorite nostalgic movies of all time with Wonderful Life, Fellowship, and Return.
All right, Brad, before we get into choosing our championship matchup, it is time for us to pause and drink some whiskey. So what do you say we try this Westland whiskey?
Let's get to it.
Okay, guys, so today we are checking out Westland Whiskey, which is a distillery in Seattle, Washington, which specializes in American single malt whiskey. Now, we have broken down before, like the etymology of the phrase single malt. When you're talking about Scotch, or to some extent Irish whiskey, when you get the word single on the bottle, it means that it came from one single distillery. It's not a blend from many distilleries. And the word malt means that it is composed of 100% barley. Now, Brad, in America, we're not used to seeing single malts being produced, but what Westland Whiskey is making is, technically qualifying for that single malt title. This is a 100% barley mash bill. The really cool thing is that they send us some materials to look over as well as we drink our whiskey. And instead of just calling it a mash bill, it's called the barley bill. And they break down all the different varieties of barley that go into each of these whiskeys. What we have today is 3 single malt whiskeys that were finished in 3 different kinds of barrels. The first of which that we're going to be trying, Brad, is the American Oak finish.
Yeah, Bob. So this Westland American Oak, it clocks in at 92 proof. So, it's a little bit on the cooler side, but not all the way down at 80 proof, which I like to see. I love a whiskey in that 90 to 95 proof range. It's non-chill filtered. It's got a really beautiful color to it. It's a nice kind of silky amber. It's a good-looking whiskey that I'm excited to get on my palate.
Yeah, Brad, and they gave us tasting notes to go along with this. I don't know that I necessarily agree with all of them. One of the things that I'm getting pretty heavily on the nose here is actually like a sparkling wine, almost a champagne kind of smell coming off of this. They say that it's like lemon, orange. I could see that. It does have that bright citrusy kind of scent on the nose, but for me, it's even more of a kind of fermented grape. It does really smell like a white wine to me.
Yeah, as I nose this, it really does kind of give off, for me, it's almost like a sparkling grape juice type of a feel. Because it feels like there's a strong, maybe not even grape, but like a darker reddish feel to the nose that feels like grape to me. And you're right, it has a weird reminiscence of champagne.
Yeah, that's definitely not so much a red for me, Brad. Like, and maybe it's just because, we're recording this just a few days after the New Year, and I definitely drank myself a champagne toast on New Year's Eve. But like that flavor profile is still in my mind as I nose this. It does have a little bit of like creaminess to it as well, though. And I don't know if that's maybe some of what you're getting as well with the sweetness. But it's like a champagne followed by like a sweet cream.
Yeah, and on top of that, it definitely smells a little bit yeasty to me. I don't know if you're picking that up or not, but it has a little bit of a grainy, yeasty kind of scent to it that isn't unpleasant.
And in the materials they sent us, they even talk about what yeast strain they used. And they were using yeast from a Saison, which is a kind of beer that is typically kind of sour. And I'm wondering if that might be contributing here as well. Brad, I just took my first sip, but I'd really love to hear what your thoughts are on the flavor here.
Yeah, it really does have a little bit of a sour yeast type flavor to it for me. It doesn't really hit a lot of sweet notes the way that I thought it would. It gets a little bit oaky near the end. The aftertaste is a little bit spicy. Not overpoweringly so, but just a little bit. I don't know. It's an intriguing whiskey. I'm not super crazy about it yet, but I'm also intrigued by it.
For me, Brad, this actually reminds me a lot of some of the whiskeys we drank from Still 630 when you brought those. Or maybe it was the St. Louis whiskey, one of the two. But we kept getting like these dark coffee and chocolate notes on a bunch of them. And this one, like the 2 predominant notes for me are dark chocolate and black coffee. And so it's a very different flavor profile from what I got on the nose. But I think like it doesn't taste accidental. It definitely tastes like they did this for a reason. And I like that. I will say on the negative side, it does taste a little bit younger than I would like it to be. But overall, I really like the difference between the nose and the taste here. I think we're off to a good start on the American Oak.
Well, let's get into this sherry wood finished American single malt whiskey. Once again, coming in at 92 proof, non-chill filtered. Bob, what are you picking up on the nose of this American sherry?
Oh, it's definitely the predominant note here is the sherry, Brad. Like this smells like really similar to the Whistler Irish whiskey that we had earlier in the season. We had a few Irish whiskeys, the Bogarts, the Sexton, and the Whistler. And the one that was the most heavily sherried, I think, was the Whistler. Although I will say that one definitely leaned more into like the saline heaviness that you get with sherry sometimes. I think this one definitely stays on the sweeter side. So maybe it is a little bit closer to that Sexton that we both really liked. But for me, this just smells like, a single malt Irish whiskey or maybe, on the unpeated Scotch side of things. But pretty standard for what we're used to from things that have been matured in sherry.
Yep. Yeah, this is really bright, really aromatic. It has some nice fruity notes to it, almost a little bit citrusy at times. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting nose that I'm excited to drink.
Oh, I like that a lot. Really inoffensive. It's like an Irish whiskey, but it doesn't have any of the kind of savory or salty, saline, heavy things going on. It definitely stays on the sweet side. One of the things that they made note of in their tasting notes was this note of oatmeal raisin cookie. I kind of actually do get that a little bit on the flavor profile here, Brad. But once again, right after I swallow, what's left on my palate is black coffee, almost an espresso bean. And I really like it. I mean, I love that it stays on the sweeter side of things. The sherry is present throughout, but it's super enjoyable. I would actually recommend this to somebody who's looking to get into like the Irish whiskey wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think I'm a little cooler on this, Bob. It starts off with some nice notes, but for me, they kind of soured quickly. And I felt like I was just getting a little bit of sourness throughout. And it just wasn't impressing me quite as much as that first American Oak did.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm actually not getting like any sourness on this at all. And this is what I love about when we do whiskeys together, Brad, because sometimes our palates are in different places. Sometimes I'm way off on something, like when I enjoyed drinking Canadian Mist and the rest of the world said I'm crazy. But I think that our last offering from Westland Whiskey is going to be right up your alley, Brad, because it is a peated whiskey.
Bob, I love me some peated whiskey. Once again, we're hitting here at 92 proof. It seems to be standard for the Westland Company. As I pull this one out, it reminds me of the sherry, but with all of the beautiful things that I love about Scotch. It's got that nice saline peatiness, just aroma to it that makes me want to dive on in.
Yeah, Brett, I'm actually not picking up much peat here. I'm kind of surprised. I had to double check that I'm drinking the peated one. It smells really similar to me to the sherry wood one. And it definitely isn't hitting me with the sort of aggressive peat that we get from something like a Lafroig or an Ardbeg. I am, to be honest, kind of struggling to identify the peat here on the nose. Is it more prominent for you?
Yeah, I think I'm getting a lot of that saline notes. Are you hitting any of those?
I think it's really subtle. Like I'm starting to pick up a little bit of peat as I swirl it around a bit more and introduce some air to it. But once again, this is, I mean, I maybe I'm alone in this, but I would say that this is definitely lightly peated.
Yes, Bob, I would agree with you. For me, coming off that American Oak and the sherry, I feel like on my nose it's hitting me pretty strong. But you're right, it's not a Lafroig lore. It's not an Oban. It's not quite as heavy on the peat, but it's really, really nice and almost a little bit refreshing after that sherry.
Yeah, I don't hate peated whiskeys. I hate it when they're like so overdone to the point where I can't taste anything else except like burnt, charred wood. And so, Brad, as you take your first sip of this, what are your initial thoughts?
I think that this is probably one of the best American peated whiskeys I've had.
This is sneaky good, man.
That's what I'm saying. It starts off a little bit smooth and sweet, but by the time you get to the back of your throat, you have all sorts of saline, you have all sorts of peat. It's a little bit smoky.
This is interesting.
I really, really enjoyed this. This is hands down my favorite one from the Westland Distillery.
I'll tell you what, like, I feel like if you wanted to just be really mean to someone who's like, I never want to try peated whiskey, you could slide this in front of them and get away with it until they go to swallow. Like, it's pretty lightly peated on the nose. And then again, it's a very thin mouthfeel. And there's not a lot going on there. And you're like, okay, it's kind of vaguely sweet. It reminds me a little bit of the sherry wood. And then when you kick it to the back of your tongue and you go to swallow, there is as much peat on this, as much, campfire kind of taste as there is in a Lafroig lore. Like it's pretty heavily peated. And yet, I think that the fact that it really subtly moves you into that helped a lot.
Yeah, whoever the master distiller is over at Westland, I think that they are doing a phenomenal job of creating a well-balanced whiskey. Like, it's not the top of the charts as far as the flavor goes, but this is one of the most beautifully balanced whiskeys that checks all the right boxes.
Yeah.
I really, really like this peated Westland whiskey.
Well, Brad, I've been reading some articles that have said that American single malt is kind of like right on the verge of blowing up because it's a market that a lot of people haven't tapped into yet. And I honestly think that what Westland is doing is really setting themselves up on the forefront of that movement. I can't, like you said, there are not a lot of American single malts out there. I can't think of a company that's producing better ones than Westland is, and I am excited to watch them as they continue to grow and carve out a spot for themselves in the market here.
Yeah, Bob, I'm right there with you. Westland Distillery is just killing it out there on the West Coast. But what say you, how about we get to finding the winner of Season 3's bracket?
Let's get to it, Brad. Okay, Brad, a task ahead of us now is to choose the championship matchup from this round of 4. And the first matchup that we have on the left side of our bracket, for those of you who are following along, is the number 1 overall seed, It's a Wonderful Life, up against the number 4 overall seed, The Fellowship of the Ring. Brad, if I'm not mistaken, when you sent back to me your ranking, your season end ranking of films that just kind of go by, your heart and your gut, I think Fellowship was the top ranked movie in that list. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct. And the second ranked movie, do you recall that one?
I think it was It's a Wonderful Life.
It sure was.
Yeah. So here's what I'm going to have us do, Brad, because I think that the prohibitive favorite here has to be It's a Wonderful Life. It's the number 1 seed. I think people would probably expect us to choose that movie. But because Fellowship was your number 1 film, I want to just turn the floor over to you, Brad, to advocate for why Fellowship could or potentially should move into our championship round over It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, Bob, I think for me, the reason I put Fellowship at the top of my list is because it hits on a few different categories for me. Critically, it was well received. People loved it. It really launched the idea that fantasy could be a viable genre in the American cinema experience, that people will eat up dense, heavy fantasy lore and they'll love it. And I really think that it led to things becoming viable like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. On top of that kind of a critical reception, the movie is just spectacular. I think it's beautifully filmed. It has great vistas. It has some really intricate cinematography. I think that the script for the movie is beautiful. It takes an amazingly large book and condenses it down into something that is somehow manageable, even when you look at the scope that it's trying to capture. And then the performances are just beautiful. You have characters who are just endearing. I just love this movie. Every bit of the movie is impactful in the way that it needs to be, and I chose it to go over It's a Wonderful Life.
Wow. I was not expecting that. I guess it was higher ranked for you than It's a Wonderful Life. Brad, in the last episode, I kind of flipped our usual criteria around for its corollary. Usually we say, like, what movie needs to go into the fiery furnace? And I asked a question of you, which of these movies does the world need to have stick around? And I think when I phrase it like that, does that make you second guess your choice at all? That we would live in a world without It's a Wonderful Life?
Oh, that's tough. That is really, really tough. I think that the heartstring that you're pulling at is the fact that this is a Christmas movie. How could the world live without their yearly tradition of watching It's a Wonderful Life? Unfortunately, Bob, I don't think tons of people actually watch it year after year the way we think that they do.
Yeah, and they should.
And they should. 100%, I think that they should because it's a spectacular movie. However, I do think that in the end, The Fellowship of the Ring is just a movie I literally can't fathom not existing for the world to know about, to watch, and to appreciate.
Well, Brad, that means that we are set up for a coin flip to get into the finals because I absolutely chose It's a Wonderful Life here. And that's not to say that I don't love The Lord of the Rings. I'm not as huge of a nerd about it as you are, Brad, but when it comes to the movie versions, I actually probably am. I went way down the rabbit hole into the production of these films, watching all the special features on the extended editions when they came out back in the day. I ate that stuff up, and I love me some Fellowship. I do think it might be my least favorite of the three films, and so that may have influenced me here, but I definitely chose It's a Wonderful Life to move on, which means it is time for a Coin of Destiny flip. It's a Wonderful Life is going to be heads. Fellowship of the Ring is going to be tails. Brad, are you ready?
Bob, I was born ready.
Brad? The Fellowship of the Ring moves on.
Yeah!
I am incredibly upset.
Yes!
All of the good movies are gone. And life is meaningless. So there you go. Fellowship of the Ring moves on into our championship round. Brad, really quickly, before we move into the second round of 4 matchup, it's time for you to give out some Film and Whiskey awards. We did this back in season 1 and didn't do it last year, and I think our episodes were the worse for it. Brad, part of the thing I love about this podcast is that you come into this podcast knowing a lot about how to do, textual criticism, like looking at texts and breaking them down. It's something that we studied all through undergrad and grad school. And you're bringing that knowledge to bear on movies that you hadn't seen before. We're filling in some pretty significant gaps in your movie viewing history. And I think that's the fun of this podcast. And so getting your initial impressions on things is really, what we're here for. And so with that in mind, Brad, we are bringing back the Brad G. Most Unexpected Award. This is the award that Brad gives to the movie that he was not really looking forward to, or that he maybe didn't know enough about, that caught him off guard in a pleasantly surprising way. So Brad, when you think through our 32 movies, what do you think you would give the award for Most Unexpected?
Man, that is a tough row to hoe. This might sound crazy. I'm going to give a runner-up and then my actual choice. The one movie that I was actually kind of surprised by was Crash. I went into Crash just thinking that it would just be a garbage movie because I feel like it is just so lambasted online as this like heretically evil movie about the, I don't know, like we talked about it. It's racist, it's sexist, it's not actually being supportive of minorities. Like that's the kind of general malaise towards that movie. However, I remember watching it and I wasn't impressed by it. Like as far as like it's not the best movie I've ever seen. It felt like an extended episode of television. But I like looking back on it now, I'm like, I don't know if it deserves to be lambasted the way that it does.
I agree.
So I think that would probably be my runner-up for Most Unexpected.
I think that, Brett, I'm glad you called attention to that movie because I think we both agree it catches more flack because it won Best Picture.
Exactly.
And I feel like people really would have left it alone if Brokeback had won the Academy Award over it.
But I think my full choice for just most like pleasantly unexpected movie is going to be Sicario. I really didn't know anything about that movie other than the fact that I remember seeing the cover and it was... I think the cover is like Alejandro in his like full tactical gear. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So literally that's all I knew about it was that cover. And so going into the movie, I was kind of like, oh, this seems interesting. Bob said it was kind of suspenseful and that I should watch it in the dark. And so I did that and it was just mind-bogglingly good. And I still think that this is going to sound dumb. I still think the fact that it might be the only like modern action movie I can think of that doesn't have a shaky cam in the action scenes still is just like mind-bogglingly beautiful to me.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna pick Sicario.
All right, Brad, on the flip side of things, we have the Brad G. Biggest Letdown Award. Now, again, this could be a movie that you were absolutely pumped to watch that ended up really underwhelming you, or it could be a movie that you were just kind of looking forward to seeing that was really underwhelming. Not something that you were necessarily super amped for. But when you factor in your expectations prior to the movie, compared to what you felt coming out of the movie, what do you think was the biggest letdown for you this year?
Oh, I mean, the obvious answer would be Coco, right? I mean, it's
just a trash movie.
Exactly. No, Bob, for me, it's going to be East of Eden. My mind jumped straight to it. I love the book. And even going into East of Eden, I was like, Brad, you got to hold back. Like, movies are never as good as the books are. Like, you need to be okay if this isn't that great. But the further away I get from East of Eden, the more I'm convinced that I just don't have any desire to watch it again.
Yeah.
And that just kind of makes me sad because the book has such a beautiful story and a beautiful moral outlook on the world that I was really hoping for in the movie, and it just didn't really translate.
Yeah, I totally get that, Brad. And I'm glad you picked something other than Bohemian Rhapsody, because I thought that was actually going to be the obvious choice.
Well, I think that going into it, I had already been warned by you and others that it was actually a garbage movie. So I just kind of went into it like bracing myself, like, all right, we're going to get through this.
That makes sense. All right, so that's Brad's winner for biggest letdown, the 1955 film East of Eden. But Brad, we have two movies to discuss here that are not letdowns. The first of which is our number 2 overall seed, Citizen Kane, going up against Brad's little movie that could, the number 14 seed, Return of the Jedi.
Bob, I really just want to see a subtitle for something saying, Citizen Kane, quote, not a letdown.
That's the best I can offer for that movie.
That's about all I could say.
Yeah.
It's not a letdown.
Brad, I mean, what have you to say at this point? We are now putting Return of the Jedi up against Citizen Kane, and it's getting ridiculous at this point.
Bob, I believe wholeheartedly in my little movie, Return of the Jedi.
All right.
Return of the Jedi is a movie that just it's one of the most beautiful endings for a movie for a movie series that I've ever seen. The character arcs are wrapped up. The human drama that is Luke and his father Luke is desperately seeking out the light side in his father, enough so that he's willing to lay down his arms. I just can't get over what a spectacular movie Return of the Jedi is, but I am going to choose Citizen Kane.
What?
Over Return of the Jedi.
Really?
If Kane was up against Empire Strikes Back, I think that I would have a much harder time choosing Kane. I would really, really have to waffle between the two. With Return of the Jedi, it is probably the most flawed of the 3 Star Wars movies. And Kane just hits on too many cylinders to not choose it over Return of the Jedi.
I feel like it's Christmas morning right now, Brad. Goodness gracious. I can't believe this. I thought I was going to have to stick up for whatever movie was going against Return of the Jedi all the way to the finals, and that the Coin of Destiny would finally have its revenge on me.
Bob, I just want to say that the Coin of Destiny is the reason you have this moment.
That's true. That's true. I also want to say, for everyone out there who likes to rag on me for being such a movie snob, I did not have Citizen Kane going to the finals. I had Coco going to the finals and beating everything else. So, Brad, in the event that Citizen Kane comes out of today with the win, it actually wasn't from my influence. And I feel like it's important to say that Brad freaking G is the one who ultimately put Citizen Kane into the final matchup.
Bob, I've said it a few times before on this episode that, I just referencing any movie that, I don't think I would ever want to watch it again. Citizen Kane is a movie that I could see myself watching, maybe not once a year, but at least once every other year, just to sit back and bask in the awesomeness that is Orson Welles. And so for me, that's really what kind of pushed it over the top, was not only is Citizen Kane a brilliant masterpiece of a film with amazing acting, a beautiful script, awesome characters, but it's a movie that I want to watch again. And I think that after I watch it a second time, I'm going to want to watch it a third time. And so for that reason, I am choosing it over Return of the Jedi.
All right, Brad, our championship matchup is set. We have the Fellowship of the Ring going up against Citizen Kane. But before we debate those two films, Brad, what do you say we take a trip down memory lane and let's count down our top 5 whiskeys of season 3? Brad, looking at our top 5 this season, I'm actually really impressed with the variety that we have here. I will say, just to spoil things, no Scotches, no Irish whiskeys ended up in our top 5. It's all bourbon and rye. However, even though we are only working in the kind of American whiskey wheelhouse here, we have whiskeys that are represented across the price range. Some are really, really affordable and like inexpensive. Some are absolutely priced at the right point. Some are very expensive. I'm excited to get into talking about them, Brad. And at number 5, we have one we tried very recently, Wild Turkey Rare Breed.
That is a tasty turkey.
Brad, I think one of the things that stands out about Rare Breed, I mean, it's delicious. It had that great cola note that we both liked a lot. It was such a smooth drinker at 116 proof, and it was like $10 to $15 cheaper than every one of its competitors' barrel proof versions.
Yeah, that was what really pushed me over the edge, is that when you look at Rare Breed in opposition to its competition, I just really think it blows them away. Like, there's other really great barrel proofs out there that cost $60 to $100. Mm-hmm. And when you're only spending $40, $45 for this Rare Breed, you have yourself a great deal, my friend.
Well, when it comes to great deals, Brad, nothing in our bracket could be topped by Early Times Bottled in Bond, which is our number 4 overall whiskey. Once again, folks, we factor in value at an equal rate as everything else in the whiskey tasting experience. You know, if you just want to get our scores on the flavor profile, you can look at our first 4 categories, but we really do want to give the average person listening to this podcast an opportunity to understand just how good of a value it is for that person to go out and buy a bottle of it. And at a liter-sized bottle for $25, there was nothing else this season, Brad, that, you know, ounce for ounce, dollar for dollar could even compete in my mind with that Early Times Bottled in Bond.
No, it really can't. And if I remember correctly, people need to go out and get some of this stuff because it's changing hands soon. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if it's going to stay, you know, the same mash bill, the same quality. So I would get out there pretty daggone quick here and get yourself some Early Times Bottled in Bond.
For sure. Brad, our number 3 whiskey is one that we tried with the guest host, Chris Blattner, and that is the Old Overholt 114. We were actually fans of regular old Overholt that we tried way back in season 1 when it was still at 80 proof. I liked it a lot as a cheap mixer, and it drank okay neat. And this 114 really took things to the next level. Brad, I do have to say, if I'm being 100% honest, I think I may have been a little swayed by Chris's enthusiasm for this. Looking back on it now, I like this whiskey a lot. I don't know if I would call it the number 3 whiskey of our season.
You know, Bob, for a rye, I think that this one had some unique notes that you were getting here, some peanut butter. It just had a beautiful nuttiness to it that I remember falling in love with. I haven't had it since, so I don't know if I can gauge whether or not it should be this high, but I will say from what I remember, I do remember it being on par with like this Rare Breed.
Yeah.
So I think it's worthy of the spot that we put it in.
Well, Brad, our number 2 rated whiskey was one that I did not think could be toppled, and that was the Booker's that we had. And that batch of Booker's, which was called Teresa's batch, is actually one of the lower rated batches of Booker's. But for some reason, you know, our palates just really, really loved that whiskey. It was just decadently sweet. And at barrel proof, it was not overly harsh either. I absolutely loved that Teresa's batch.
Yeah, and it, at the time, I believe, was our highest ranked whiskey of all time at a 45. Yeah, I think what you used already, Bob, decadent. Like, This was just a velvety, beautiful whiskey that I, frankly, want some more of. But in the end, it was toppled by what I just still hate that I love it so much.
Yeah.
The disaster of a system that is BTAC. The Thomas H. Handy Sazerac Rye.
Oh my gosh,
God bless it if it's not one of the best whiskeys I will ever drink in my life.
Yeah, I'm going to say, to this point, it may be the best whiskey I've ever had. And, you know, again, Brad and I have not been able to really dip our toes too far into the allocated whiskey pool because we are, you know, just a couple years removed from grad school. We are definitely not bankrolling.
Poor.
Yeah,
poor, Bob.
Poor. That's the word. That's the word. We're poor. But Brad, getting a sample of that 2019 Thomas H. Handy, it was just one of the most complex again, I'll say the word decadent rise I've ever had. The barrel proof was great on that thing. The only thing that kept it from being like a perfect score almost is the fact that you can't really factor in buying a bottle of it. And the value score for us was done much differently than normal, Brad. We actually scored it out based on if you can find a pour of it at a whiskey bar as opposed to buying a bottle. Yep. That's the only way most of us are ever going to get it.
Yeah, once again, I'm just going to keep digging the grave with Buffalo Trace. And the problem is I love Buffalo Trace. Eagle Rare is one of my favorite like budget whiskeys out there. But Buffalo Trace, you can go kick rocks. Give us more good whiskey and stop freaking allocating it the way you do. Drives me nuts.
All right, Brad, those were our top 5 whiskeys of the year, but now it's time for us to crown the best movie of the year. So what do you say we get into this championship matchup?
I am so excited for this, Robert.
All right, Brad, enough talking. Fellowship of the Ring versus Citizen Kane. We've talked about both movies extensively. I think this is just going to come down to head versus heart here, right? Like, I think, Brad, even as somebody who put Fellowship as their number 1 movie, it's hard to bet against Citizen Kane if you're just using your head and not your heart in this.
Here's the thing, though, Bob. I'm going to use the exact same argument that I used for the last matchup of Kane versus Return. That the reason Return lost is because Return is a movie I will watch year in and year out for the rest of my life. But there are a lot of technical issues with the movie. Whereas Kane is a movie I want to rewatch and doesn't have those problems. Fellowship of the Ring is a movie I'm going to watch the rest of my life, and I don't think that there are very many problems with the movie. I really think it is a masterpiece of a film. And so for me, I am going to go with what I would say is my head and my heart and pick Fellowship over Citizen Kane.
Yeah, and I figured you would do that, Brad. And I think for me, if this was The Two Towers versus Citizen Kane, I think I would actually lean on your side. And I would say The Two Towers is a movie that means more to me and that is nearly equivalently, perfect from a technical side of things to Citizen Kane. However, I've gone on record saying I think the theatrical version of Fellowship is the worst of the 3 theatrical versions. I think it did have some flaws. I think they were still figuring out the visual language of this series a little bit, and they ironed those kinks out in the subsequent films. And I think the fact that both of the other 2 films are better in my mind, I think I'm going to pick Citizen Kane here, which I'm surprised to be doing that because I so easily knocked it out in favor of Coco in my own bracket. But that means, Brad, that we are at odds here when it comes to our championship matchup.
Yeah, Bob, we really are. And I think in the end, we just have to go one last time and flip the coin of destiny.
Well, Brad, you have been such a trooper hanging in there with me, rambling on and on about movies for almost 2 full years now, that I will let you do the honors, Brad, to select the winner of the season 3 bracket. Brad, Fellowship will be heads, Citizen Kane will be tails. Flip that coin.
Bob, the winner of the season 3 Film and Whiskey Movie Bracket Challenge is Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring.
Wow. Brad, I'll tell you what, for being a top 4 movie, if you had asked me at the beginning of this bracket, if I thought that would be the winner, I probably would have said no. I guess I just assumed it would end up getting knocked out by a Coco, by a Citizen Kane, by an It's a Wonderful Life. But that does not mean that it isn't a very worthy winner of our season 3 bracket.
Yeah, Bob, I'm not going to lie. My final 4 to championship match to champion was impeccable.
Wow.
Every single one went the way that I thought it would, and that's because I am just good and right, and I think God loves me a little bit more than he loves you. So.
Well, Brad, that might be true. I did have 3 of the final 4 correct. The only one that was different was Coco in place of Return of the Jedi, and I continued to pick Coco the rest of the way. It's just a movie that's near and dear to my heart. But I do think that, for the most part, we were in pretty strong agreement on this final 4 matchup. And that means that the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, is our victor. Brad, before we sign off here, I know we're running a little bit long today. Before we sign off, I want to give some thank yous to the people who have really helped us get through season 3, I think at the best place we've ever been as a podcast, Brad. And the first people I'd like to thank would be our guest hosts. We've had a few people come on and host an episode with us. So I want to give a shout out to Jen Lowers, to Chris Blattner, Urban Bourbonist, and to Perry Ritter, host of This Is My Bourbon podcast.
Well, Bob, it was just wonderful to have Chris and Jen and Perry on the podcast. We had so much fun with them. And I guess I'd like to also shout out a few of our Patreon members. One of them, Austin, has been loving on us from literally the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's the host of the Bourboneering podcast. He might be our most ardent supporter. And Austin, we just want to say thank you so much. You are just a wonderful individual. If you haven't listened to his podcast, go check it out. It is Bourboneering. A few of our other patrons out there, James, Corey, you guys know who you are. We love you guys. We're so thankful for your support. We will keep giving you some amazing content that hopefully you guys keep on believing in, because we love what we do here at the Film and Whiskey Podcast.
Absolutely. Brad, we can't say thank you enough to the people who donated whiskey to us this year, including our new friend Bourbon and Stuff, who was kind enough to send along, probably half of our whiskeys this season, including that wonderful BTAC sample that we got. Brad, we found our first sponsor this year in Silk City Hot Sauce. We had partnerships going with Bitters Lab. Like, I can't believe from season 2 to season 3 how much this podcast has grown, and I am so excited to take it to another level in season 4.
Yeah, we are so excited to turn it up to 11 with you guys. Season 4 has an amazing lineup of movies. We're going to have some great guest hosts, some great bonus episodes coming your way. Bob, is there anything coming down the pipeline that people need to know about?
Well, Brad, we are going to be taking a break for the month of February. In place of our regular Monday episodes, we'll be releasing a few interviews that we've done on Mondays instead of on bonus episode Thursdays. So to get you through February, you will have some bonus interviews, but Brad and I are going to take some much needed and I would say well-earned time off here. And we will be back the first week of March with our first episode of season 4. Brad, I can't thank you enough for hanging in there with me. I can't thank Film and Whiskey enough for being on this ride with us. It's been a good season, man.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, we're going to take February off. February of 2019 is, I believe, when the very first episodes of the Film and Whiskey podcast came out.
Yes.
So we have released an episode every single Monday and what feels like every other Thursday for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
So I don't know about you, man, but I'm ready for a little bit of a break, but it just energizes me to think about coming back in March with some great content.
Yeah, I can't wait. All right, guys, that's going to do it for us here at the Film and Whiskey Podcast, signing off for season 3. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you in March.